A millionaire was yelling at a waitress, and then she said one thing, and a shocking silence fell. In a luxury restaurant, waitress. Jessica encounters billionaire. Carson Hale, powerful, rude, accustomed to impunity. But when he publicly humiliates her, she doesn't back down, doesn't get rude, doesn't argue. She simply responds directly, calmly, like a human being. Before we begin the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. If anyone had known how this phrase would turn out, maybe the room would have fallen silent, even before Carson Hale opened his mouth. But the evening began like hundreds of others, and no one knew that today someone would stop being afraid of someone. The rain had been pouring for 3 hours. It never stopped, pounding on the roof of the car, on the umbrellas, on the window. The Elysian Table restaurant, a place where lobster was served before water, was packed to capacity. Outside, cars with tinted windows were parked, and the coat check smelled of expensive perfume and wet leather. Jessica stood at the counter, checking the order for table 16. 3 men sat by the window, one of them in the center, with high cheekbones, silver in his hair, and a face familiar to the entire country. Carson Hale, media mogul, owner of a major television network and dozens of magazines, was said to have once fired a man for making a rude comment on air. Waiters, as a rule, tried to avoid his eye twice. He ordered quickly, without looking at Jessica. He picked up the menu, leafed through it, as if signing bank papers, and tossed it on the table. Steak, medium rare, no side dish, red. Wine, French. Better shut up if you don't know the difference, he said, looking at his phone. Jessica nodded. She always nodded, never speaking unnecessarily. Her notebook was neat, and her gait was quick but silent. In 3 years at the Elysian Table, she had seen a lot. People who started the evening with a smile and ended it with hysterics. Men who ordered expensive dishes but forgot their wives' names. Women who cried in the restroom before returning to the table. She brought the order 20 minutes later. The steak was cooked to perfection. The sauce was served separately. The wine was room temperature. Jessica approached the table and, without interrupting the conversation, placed the plate in front of Hale. He didn't look. He cut a piece, ate it, and suddenly looked up. "You brought me a medium steak," he said. "Even though I clearly said medium rare, this isn't just a mistake. This is an insult. This isn't dinner. This is a slap in the face." The room grew quiet. Even the background music seemed quieter. 2 tables nearby fell silent. Eyes turned to the waiters. What would she say? Usually, waiters apologized, said they'd fix it, left quickly, and tried not to be caught again. But Jessica didn't apologize right away. She looked directly at Hale and remained silent just long enough for the silence to be noticeable. "I apologize," she finally said calmly. "I'll check with the kitchen to see if there was a mistake, but if you don't mind." She leaned forward slightly. "We all make mistakes. I try to treat everyone with respect, with a sandwich or a langoustine. And you can do the same." Her words were soft, without a challenge, without pressure. She wasn't arguing. She was simply reminding. Hale froze. He seemed to want to say something, but couldn't. His lips trembled. He looked at her, as if she were an equation with something missing. Then he stood up, without looking at his companions, the room, or the waitress, and left without waiting for the second course or paying. When he disappeared through the glass door, a special silence fell over the restaurant, the kind that comes not from fear, but from surprise. People exchanged glances, but remained silent. No one knew what to say. One of the men at Hale's table whispered, "Are you crazy, girl?" But Jessica didn't answer. She cleared her plate and went into the kitchen. It was warm there, smelling of meat, cream, and oregano. "Everything okay?" the chef asked. "Yes," she replied, taking the order for table 8. That night, she went to bed later than usual. There were no new messages on her phone. It was raining outside. She remembered Hale's gaze and felt no fear. Only a strange, heavy silence inside. She didn't know that at that very moment, in a penthouse on the opposite side of town, Carson Hale was sitting by the huge window with a glass of wine and remembering not his wine, not his steak. He was remembering how, many years ago, someone had dropped change on the floor and he had picked it up without looking up. Carson wasn't sleeping, and not because he was angry. It was more complicated than that. For The first time in many years, someone told him the truth and didn't apologize for it. He wasn't used to this feeling. He couldn't name it. It burned inside. It kept him from sleeping, kept him from thinking, kept him from forgetting. The next morning, he canceled a meeting with investors he'd spent a week preparing for. He told his secretary he felt ill, though in reality, he felt something completely different. A feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Shame. He poured himself a strong coffee and sat down in a chair by the panoramic window. The city wakened, the cars moved steadily, the streets glistened after the rain, passers-by hurried in all directions. He watched it all, but saw nothing. In his head, there was only her. Jessica, a strange name, ordinary, unresonant, but he remembered it. That rarely happens. Usually, people for him are functions, habits, predictable reactions, but she was different. He remembered that night as if he were watching a movie about someone else. The scene in the restaurant. Her voice quiet, confident, unassuming. No fear, no audacity, only clarity. It was strange, unfamiliar, wrong, but powerful. And something inside him began to creak like a forgotten mechanism. He stood up, went to the safe, opened it, and took out an old box containing letters, photos, a notebook, and an old waiter's badge with his name, Carson. He was 16 then. He worked in a cheap cafe on the outskirts. His father had died 2 years earlier. His mother was barely hanging on. He needed help. He brought trays, took out the trash, wiped tables, and endured insults. He remembered one incident in particular. An elderly woman tossed a few coins on the floor. "Tip, boy," she said, without even looking. He bent down and picked them up, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't help himself. He needed this money. Then he vowed to himself, one day he will be the man to whom no one dares say no. He kept his promise. More than 20 years passed, and now a waitress in an expensive restaurant looks him in the eye and tells him he could be human. Carson poured himself another coffee, unsweetened. Black, like in that cafe. He felt something moving inside him. The memory became the key. He didn't want to think about it, but now he couldn't help but think about it. He called his assistant. "Find me the name of that waitress who served me yesterday." "At which restaurant?" "Elysian Table." Was everything bad? No, everything was right. The assistant fell silent, but then said, "I'll find out." Carson hung up, sat back, and looked out the window. The world hadn't changed, but he had begun. That same evening, he received the file. Name, Jessica Gallagher, 25 years old. Has been at the restaurant for 3 years. No problems, no complaints. Lives in a rented apartment in the southwest of the city. No parents. Studied, but didn't finish. Had to work. Carson read these lines and thought of himself again. 16 years old. His father's death. A mother who couldn't afford medicine. Work, resentment. The promise to rise above everyone else. And now, a woman who possessed nothing but her own dignity. Reminded him of who he was, who he could have remained. He stared at the screen for a long time, then opened another document. A bank one. He had completed a transfer of $50,000. Without explanation, without the sender's name. Just his signature, Carson. Hale. He didn't know if she would accept it, but that wasn't important. It wasn't compensation, not a ransom. It was a gesture, an act. The first step toward becoming himself again. Meanwhile, Jessica stood at the counter, as usual. Her shift was coming to an end. It had been a difficult day. The coffee machine hadn't worked since morning. Then someone had spilled wine on the tablecloth. The customer at table 9 was acting like a child. She was tired. And then the manager approached her, holding a white envelope. It looked official. Just your name. No instructions. Veronica took it, opened it, and inside was a check. 50,000. Not a word, just a signature. Carson Hale. Her heart began to beat faster. It wasn't fear, or joy, or anger. It was something she couldn't name. Her gaze froze on the numbers. This was more than she earned in a year. She immediately thought, does he really think he can pay her to keep quiet? She sat down in the hut. The envelope lay in front of her, a cup of cheap tea next to it. She didn't know what to do. To accept means to agree. To refuse means to reject, perhaps not the money, but the gesture. But she didn't know how it began or the value of his signature. That night, she didn't sleep for a long time. The money lay in her drawer. She couldn't bring herself to spend it, couldn't even imagine what to do with it. as if it weren't money but a question she had yet to answer. Things can be appreciated, actions can be understood. But what about a silent gift from a man accustomed to giving orders? And can one believe that he truly wants to change anything? Jessica had been holding the envelope in her hands for the third evening in a row. It lay on the edge of her desk, like a challenge. She looked at it as if it were someone else's letter, forbidden to open, but impossible not to open. She didn't talk about it at work, or with anyone. She had few friends. Her school friends had long since left. Those who remained lived a different life, with children, mortgages, with neighbors on the landing. She had books, a studio apartment, and long shifts. The manager who handed her the envelope said nothing, but looked with curiosity. Rumors began to circulate in the restaurant. Someone whispered that Hale had bought her. Someone that she had saved his life, and he had thanked her in this way. Jessica remained silent. She simply didn't know what to think. That evening, a week after the incident, she was again working by the window. A light, dry snow was falling. Almost imperceptibly, there were fewer guests than usual. The weather was hindering those who wanted to shine. She was serving the 8th table when one of the junior waiters quietly approached her. At the entrance, they ask you, "Who?" He didn't say. Just an adult without a coat, standing there, as if he didn't know whether to come in or go. Jessica wiped her hands, adjusted her fortuitous dress, and went to the cloakroom. Within 3 steps, she recognized him. Carson Hale, without security, without an escort, without the haughty mask on his face. He looked at her and suddenly looked away for the first time. "Can you spare me a minute?" She nodded. He gestured to the empty waiting room by the window. They sat down. He didn't begin right away. He paused, as if choosing his words. "I'm not used to being in charge," he finally said. "I'm used to people remaining silent or agreeing, even if I'm wrong, especially if I'm wrong." Veronica remained silent. He continued, "But that evening you didn't argue. You didn't shout. You didn't fight. You simply reminded me that I am a human being and you are an equal." And I realized I had become the very thing I would have despised in my youth. She listened without interrupting. This was not a confession. It was the confession of a man who had found the courage to speak when it was too late, but still necessary. He took a second envelope from his inside pocket, different from the first, thicker, and placed it on the table. "I sent you a check," he said, "not as payment, not as a gift, as a reaction. But then I realized, this is not it, not everything. And I came to explain." She took the envelope and opened it. There was no money, only a letter and an enclosed document, an invitation to take the position of executive director of a foundation created by his media group. The purpose of the foundation is to support women who find themselves in difficult life circumstances, loneliness, violence, social pressure. The foundation was called Jessica's Voice. She looked up, not immediately sure what to say. It was as if he had read her thoughts. "I want this foundation to be led not by a politician, not a media personality, not someone who can speak beautifully, but by someone who can speak simply when everyone else is silent." Silence. She felt everything inside her. Mixed, confusion, anxiety, something akin to pride. But loudest of all, doubt. "Why did you choose me?" she finally asked. "I'm no one. I didn't even graduate from college. I have no experience. You have something else." When everyone in the room fell silent, "You spoke not to win, but to remind. And I want your voice to be heard not only in that room." She didn't answer right away, simply put the letter back in the envelope, then looked at him. "I need to think." He nodded, not insisting, stood up, and looked at her again, but this time without the previous harshness. There was something new in his gaze, not softness, but respect. "I'll leave my contact information. Think about it as long as you need." He left, just as he had then, quietly, without pathos, but now she didn't blurt it out, not arrogantly, just like a human being. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep for a long time again. The phrase foundation director sounded like it came from another world. She couldn't even imagine how it was possible. But deep down, somewhere, she knew. After that evening, after that meeting, she could no longer be just a waitress, as if nothing had happened. She took an old notebook out of a drawer. Once, as a child, she had written dreams in it. To study, to help, to do something real. Then, life changed, but the notebook remained, and the lines in it, too. Now she read them and understood. Perhaps someone had just reopened the door for her to the very life she had once dreamed of. There are decisions that are made in a moment, and there are those that take everything: nerves, fear, the past. And yet, the morning comes when a person puts on new clothes and takes the first step. A week after her conversation with Carson Hale, Jessica handed in her resignation. The restaurant was taken aback. The chef frowned. The manager exchanged glances with the accountant. Everyone thought it was because of the scandal. She didn't explain anything, simply signed the papers, returned the uniform, and walked around the room. For the last time in this room, she left behind 3 years of her life. And one phrase that changed her destiny. The Jessica's Voice Foundation was located in the city center on the 7th floor of a large glass building, not in a tower, but not in a basement either. It was modest and bright. On the door was a sign she'd only seen on the day of her first visit. Under her name was the inscription, Executive Director. Jessica clutched the strap of her bag and entered. Inside were 3 offices, a common room, a board with projects. Several young women were discussing something over laptops. One, Michelle, approached and extended her hand. "Welcome. We've been waiting for you." Since then, everything changed, and it began with studies. Carson insisted. Before heading the foundation, she had to complete a course in nonprofit management. It was 2 months of immersion, lectures, case studies, group work, meetings with curators. At first, she felt like an outsider. Everyone else had experience, spoke in terms, knew the acronyms. She was silent, wrote down, and read at night. Waitressing shifts gave way to a schedule of study blocks and analytical assignments. Sometimes she wanted to quit, but then she remembered that evening, not because she wanted to repeat it, but because it reminded her that her voice mattered. 2 months later, she returned to the foundation's office, now a person who knew what she was doing. She gathered the team and said, "We'll have 3 areas. First, emergency psychological help for women who have survived violence. Second, financial literacy and employment courses. Third, help for single mothers. Food, housing, support." Michelle nodded. 2 more, a young lawyer and a psychologist, were taking notes. Someone asked, "Where do we start?" Jessica answered without pause. "With those who don't have time to wait." They started with the shelter, negotiated with volunteers, looked for a place, packed their things, then brought in pro bono lawyers. The first calls came, the first women, the first stories. Jessica listened to them and recognized herself in them. Not literally, but in fear, in confusion, in loneliness. She knew what it was like when you think no one will listen. And now she could become that who hears. One day, there was a knock on her office. It was a girl of about 20, dark-haired, wearing a jacket, one size too big, holding a bag, and looking empty. "They told me they help here." "Sit down," Jessica said calmly. It was Rachel. She lived with a guy who drank, then beat her, then kicked her out. She had nobody, no job. Her documents were almost expired. No food, no place to live. Jessica listened, wrote down, called a lawyer, a psychologist, and volunteers. By evening, Rachel was already at the shelter. 3 days later, she had new documents. A week later, a place in free courses. A month later, her first job in a pastry shop. Rachel later admitted, "I came here because you don't look like a government official. You listened. It was like I was human again." Jessica was silent for a long time after these words, then went out into the hallway and locked herself in the break room. She sat down on a chair. For the first time in a long time, she cried, not from pain, but from the fact that all of this was real. A month later, the foundation was invited to a press conference. Journalists, partners, and city representatives had gathered. The hall was noisy, with lights and cameras. Carson sat to the side, in a suit, without security or assistance. He did not go on stage. Jessica took the stage. The journalists were persistent. "Why you? Why not a major specialist? Why was the foundation named after you?" She looked into the audience, as she once did, into Carson's face, and said, Because in that room, when everyone was silent, I spoke. A simple phrase, but the audience fell silent. Carson later spoke briefly. People say that power corrupts. It's true. But sometimes, very rarely, one honest voice restores your face. That night, Jessica sat by the window for a long time. The city roared outside. Her inbox was full of dozens of letters. Women wrote, "You gave me hope." She closed her laptop, picked up an old notebook, and on the last page she wrote, "Today, I realized I didn't change the world. I simply made it quieter so someone could speak." Sometimes it ends with applause, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with a simple phrase that a person says to themselves in the mirror in the morning and, for the first time in a long time, recognizes themselves. 6 months passed. The voice of Jessica Foundation was already working in 3 directions, as she had conceived. There was a 20-bed shelter, weekly courses, a hotline, and the team had grown. Volunteers from universities, doctors, lawyers, and IT specialists showed up, building the website for free. Several companies made regular donations. Every morning began the same way. Tea in the kitchen, a line to make. Phone calls, checking reports. Children's laughter in the hallways. Women with children appeared at the shelter. Sometimes it was difficult, sometimes it seemed she couldn't stand it. But when Jessica heard a whispered thank you, it was enough to continue. Journalists continued writing. The headlines varied. How one waitress changed a media mogul. An unexpected voice, the power of silent courage. Some articles were pretentious. She didn't like them. Some were kind. One was precise. They wrote, "Jessica didn't save anyone. She simply wouldn't turn away." They asked her to speak, to give interviews, but she refused. There were too many words and too few actions. She chose the latter. And yet, one day, she had to go on stage. A city conference on social policy. Everyone was invited, officials, businessmen, public organizations. Jessica initially said no, but Carson insisted. "Not for PR," he said, "but for those who will listen. Your voice is not needed by me, but by them." She agreed, on the condition of no cameras, no advertising banners, just live speech. There were about 100 people in the hall. She sat in the front row with a folder. Inside was a speech, written overnight, dry and precise. But when her name was announced, she left the folder on a chair, came out, took the microphone, looked at the audience, and spoke. "When I worked as a waitress, I had many opportunities to remain silent, to agree, to smile, even when they shouted at you. This isn't weakness, it's survival. But one day I realized, if I remain silent again, I will cease to be myself." She paused for a second, then continued, "Power isn't just money. Power is the ability to speak when others can't." That evening in the restaurant, I simply reminded them that behind a steak and a suit, a person is no more, no less. The audience listened quietly, without a rustle, without phones. Even the officials didn't interrupt. Today, I stand here not because I have a diploma or connections, but because one person, strong, influential, heard instead of ordering. It happens rarely, but it is enough to change someone's life. Pause. Someone applauded. The rest simply sat, listened, absorbed. She finished. "I don't want to be called a hero. I want there to be more voices like mine. Because, in a world where too much is said, true power lies in those who can speak. When everyone is silent." After her speech, women, students, mothers, and social workers approached her. They spoke quietly, with pursed lips, as if afraid of being interrupted. They thanked, shared, asked how they could help. Later, Carson approached. He looked different, relaxed, calm. He no longer looked down on everyone. "You were real," he said. "Do they feel it?" "They always do." Jessica nodded, smiled, and suddenly asked, "Do you regret leaving then?" He looked at her. For a long time, "No," he replied, "because if he had stayed, everything would have been different. I would have apologized out of politeness, given a tip, and left the same, but you gave me the opportunity to become different. Not that night, later, but thanks to you." 2 months later, the foundation received an award. The money went toward opening a second shelter. Rachel, the same girl with the jacket, now led a support group, helping Others, just as she had once been helped. A club for teenagers appeared. A psychologist held classes for women who were afraid to start relationships after violence. Life went on. 1. Early morning, Jessica got up, as usual. She drank tea and looked out the window. The city was waking up, as it had been that night, when it had rained, and her heart thumped with tension. Now, silence. She went to the mirror, looked at her reflection, her calm face, tired eyes, her firm gaze, and, for the first time in a long time, she recognized herself.